Picture yourself walking with a band of hunter-gatherers 15,000 years ago. The landscape stretches endlessly before you, every feature holding meaning. These people move through their world with a grace and understanding that took millennia to perfect. Their minds carry maps more detailed than any modern GPS, not just of places, but of seasons, cycles, and the intricate web of life itself. Watch as a hunter examines a set of tracks in the morning dew. She's not just seeing footprints. Her mind processes countless variables: the depth of the impression, its moisture content, the displaced vegetation. In seconds, she knows not just what animal passed by, but when, in what condition, and even its likely destination. This is a mind trained in patterns that most modern humans have forgotten how to see. The archaeological record shows us their mastery. At ancient campsites, we find evidence of precision thinking. Stone tools crafted with extraordinary skill. Bones that tell stories of careful butchering, with cuts made exactly where anatomy dictates they should be. These weren't random strikes but planned sequences of actions, passed down through generations of teaching and learning. Their seasonal camps tell us of minds that understood time differently than we do, not by clocks or calendars, but through the rhythm of migrating herds, blooming plants, and changing weather patterns. Each location in their territory served a purpose: summer fishing camps by rivers, autumn nut-gathering sites in forests, winter shelters in protected valleys. They read the world like a book written in tracks, stems, clouds, and stars. Around their fires, knowledge passed from old to young in ways we're only beginning to understand. Their oral traditions didn't just contain stories. They held vital information about animal behavior, plant properties, weather patterns, and survival techniques. These were not simple tales but complex educational tools, encoding generations of accumulated wisdom in memorable forms. The evidence shows us how they thought in networks. Trade items found at their campsites reveal connections spanning hundreds of miles. Shells from distant coasts appear in inland settlements. Specific types of stone tools trace regular routes of exchange. These people maintained complex social relationships across vast distances, all without writing or permanent settlements. Look closely at their toolmaking sites. We find areas where novices practiced, their attempts marked by characteristic mistakes. Nearby, we see the work of masters, their products showing perfect understanding of how stone breaks, how bone splits, how sinew binds. This was structured learning, complex knowledge passed down through careful instruction and practice. Their art tells us of minds capable of profound symbolic thought. Handprints on cave walls speak across millennia. Animal images capture not just physical forms, but the essence of movement and life. These weren't just decorations. They were ways of understanding and expressing their relationship with the world around them. Watch as they gather plants. See how they test new foods, carefully, systematically, building knowledge of what's edible, what's medicinal, what's deadly. Their understanding of plant properties was so precise that many of their plant use traditions still inform modern pharmacology. This wasn't just trial and error, it was scientific thinking before science had a name. These hunter-gatherers were not simple wanderers waiting for agriculture to give them purpose. They were sophisticated peoples whose minds held vast libraries of ecological knowledge. Their cognitive capabilities laid the foundation for what was to come. They understood cause and effect, patterns in nature, and the complexities of animal and plant behavior. These were the minds that would eventually glimpse the possibility of cultivation, setting humanity on a new path that would change everything. The stage was set for one of the most profound transitions in human history. But first, these people had to look at the wild plants they gathered and see something more: the potential for a different way of living. That moment of realization would begin a revolution in human consciousness and reshape our relationship with the natural world forever. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a wild wheat field in the Fertile Crescent, around 14,000 years ago. Something unprecedented is happening. A woman examines fallen grain heads with unusual intensity. She's looking at them differently than her ancestors ever did. In her mind, a revolutionary thought is taking shape, not just about what these plants are, but what they could become. The archaeological record shows us this moment of transformation. At sites like Ohalo II near the Sea of Galilee, we find the first signs of intensive wild grain collection. Stone sickles appear, their edges polished from cutting thousands of grass stems. Large grinding stones tell us of systematic processing. These tools mark the beginning of a new relationship with plants. Watch as early gatherers begin to understand the cycle of seeds. They notice how dropped grains sprout into new plants, how certain plants grow better in disturbed soil around their camps. They observe how bigger seeds tend to produce bigger plants. These weren't just observations. They were the first steps toward a new way of thinking about the natural world. The evidence shows us how this new understanding spread. We find caches of selected seeds, carefully stored in lined pits. These aren't just food stores. They're the first signs of humans thinking about plants as something they could influence. The largest, fullest grain heads were being saved, unconsciously beginning the process of domestication. Consider the cognitive leap this required. These people had to understand cause and effect over months, not just days or weeks. They needed to grasp abstract concepts about plant life cycles. They had to imagine future harvests. This was a fundamental shift in how human minds process time and possibility. Around their fires, new kinds of conversations were taking place. People discussed which plants grew best where, which seeds produced the most food, how to protect promising patches of wild grain. Knowledge about plant behavior was becoming more systematic, more focused on potential rather than just immediate needs. We see this transition in how they organize their living spaces. Semi-permanent camps begin to appear near productive wild grain fields. Storage pits become more common, more carefully constructed. These people weren't yet farmers, but their minds were beginning to think like farmers, about investment, patience, and the relationship between effort and reward. Study the tools from this period. They show increasing specialization. Baskets for collecting specific types of seeds. Tools designed precisely for harvesting particular plants. This isn't just technology evolving. It's evidence of minds developing more sophisticated categories and classifications. The most remarkable change was happening in how these people understood their own role in nature. They were moving from participants in natural cycles to potential shapers of those cycles. This required a profound shift in consciousness, from seeing the world as something that simply is to something that could be influenced and changed. Watch as they begin the first tentative experiments with planting. Not yet agriculture as we know it, but deliberate scattering of seeds in promising locations. These weren't random actions but tests, driven by new questions about how plants grow and how humans might encourage that growth. This period marks the beginning of humanity's great project of reshaping nature. The cognitive capabilities that made it possible, abstract thinking, long-term planning, systematic observation, would become central to human consciousness and achievement. The seeds being planted would grow into more than just crops. They would grow into new ways of understanding our relationship with the world itself. The stage was now set for the next great leap, the emergence of true farming communities. But first, these early experimenters had to transform their tentative insights into systematic knowledge, their occasional successes into reliable methods. This would require new forms of cooperation, new ways of organizing society, and new patterns of thought that would change human consciousness forever. At sites like Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, we see the first clear evidence of humans reorganizing their entire way of life around cultivated plants. These settlements, dating back 12,000 years, tell us an extraordinary story of minds creating entirely new forms of social organization and belief. Watch as the first true farming villages take shape. Houses cluster together, built from mud, brick, and stone. Unlike the temporary shelters of their hunter-gatherer ancestors, these structures are made to last. Each one represents a profound shift in how humans thought about place and permanence. They were creating spaces that would outlive their builders. The archaeological record shows us how they organized their communities. Storage buildings appear at central locations. Grinding areas are set up near communal spaces. Work areas for different tasks are carefully arranged. These weren't random arrangements but planned spaces, showing minds that could think systematically about social organization and efficiency. See how knowledge begins to concentrate in these early settlements. Some houses show evidence of specialized toolmaking. Others reveal signs of ritual activity. Still others suggest food processing on a large scale. This specialization of space reflects specialization of knowledge, the beginning of craft traditions that would be passed down through generations. The evidence of their farming practices reveals growing sophistication. Fields show signs of deliberate flooding for moisture control. Early irrigation channels appear. Crop rotation leaves distinctive patterns in the soil. These people weren't just planting. They were developing complex systems of agricultural management that required remarkable levels of planning and cooperation. Around their hearths, new kinds of social bonds were forming. No longer just family groups, but larger communities with shared interests and obligations. We find evidence of communal storage and distribution systems. These required new ways of thinking about ownership, fairness, and social responsibility. Study the tools they left behind. Sickles become more standardized, showing shared knowledge of what works best. Storage vessels grow larger and more numerous. Grinding stones show signs of constant use. These aren't just improvements in technology, they're evidence of minds developing standardized solutions to common problems. The most profound changes appear in their ritual spaces. Communal buildings emerge that seem to have no practical purpose except gathering. Special objects appear that suggest organized belief systems. These people were creating new ways to understand their changing relationship with the natural world. Watch as children learn in these early farming communities. Unlike their hunter-gatherer ancestors who learned primarily through observation and imitation, these children had to master complex sequences of seasonal tasks. They needed to understand concepts like property, planning, and delayed reward. New forms of teaching and learning were emerging. Their trade networks tell us of minds thinking on larger scales. Materials move between settlements in regular patterns. Exotic items appear that must have traveled hundreds of miles. These weren't just exchanges of goods, but exchanges of ideas, techniques, and knowledge. The relationship with animals begins to change as well. We find evidence of early animal domestication alongside plant cultivation. This required deep understanding of animal behavior, breeding patterns, and herd management. These people were becoming active shapers of other species' evolution. Most remarkably, we see the emergence of long-term planning. Seed grain is carefully separated from food grain. Fields are prepared seasons in advance. Building projects show phases of construction spanning years. These minds were thinking further into the future than any humans had before. This period marks the creation of entirely new forms of human society. The cognitive capabilities that made farming possible, abstract thinking, long-term planning, systematic observation, were now being applied to social organization itself. The seeds planted in fertile soil were growing into more than crops. They were growing into civilization. Watch as these early farming communities begin to innovate in ways that would transform human society forever. At sites across the Fertile Crescent, we find evidence of minds grappling with new challenges and finding ingenious solutions that would shape the future of agriculture. In the rich soils near ancient rivers, we see the first signs of deliberate irrigation. Channels cut into earth, carefully planned to direct water where it's needed most. These weren't random ditches, but engineered systems that required understanding of water flow, soil absorption, and seasonal flooding patterns. Each channel tells us of minds that could think in 3 dimensions, could calculate slopes, and predict water movement. The tools they created show remarkable specialization. Digging sticks evolve into wooden plows. Simple sickles become more sophisticated with carefully crafted handles and replaceable blades. Storage vessels grow larger and more elaborate, with designs that kept grain dry and protected from pests. Each innovation reveals deeper understanding of materials and natural processes. Study how they manage their crops. Early farmers learned to plant different species together, creating beneficial relationships between plants. They discovered how to rotate crops to maintain soil fertility. They developed methods to protect their harvests from insects and decay. These weren't just practical solutions. They were evidence of systematic observation and experimentation. Around their settlements, we find the first evidence of deliberate soil improvement. Middens containing organic waste were systematically spread on fields. Ash from hearths was distributed across growing areas. These people were learning to enhance the natural fertility of the soil, showing understanding of decay and renewal cycles. The archaeological record reveals how they adapted to different environments. In drier regions, we find evidence of drought-resistant crops being selected and developed. In wetter areas, drainage systems appear. Along coastlines, salt-tolerant varieties emerge. Each adaptation shows minds responding creatively to environmental challenges. Watch as they develop new ways to process their harvests. Grinding technologies become more efficient. Cooking methods evolve to make new crops more digestible and nutritious. Storage techniques improve to prevent spoilage. These weren't just technological advances. They were solutions that required understanding complex chemical and biological processes. The most fascinating innovations appear in their breeding practices. We can trace how they selected larger grains, stronger stems, more productive varieties. Though they couldn't see the genetics at work, they understood enough about inheritance to gradually transform wild plants into domesticated crops that depended on human care for survival. See how knowledge spreads between communities. Similar innovations appear in different regions, adapted to local conditions. Trade routes carry not just goods but agricultural techniques and technologies. These networks of knowledge sharing would accelerate the pace of innovation and adaptation. Their calendar systems become more sophisticated. Rock art and carved objects show signs of tracking seasonal changes. These weren't just recordings of time but tools for planning agricultural activities months in advance. They represent minds that could think systematically about future needs and preparations. Most remarkably, we find evidence of agricultural experimentation. Test plots appear where new varieties were tried. Different techniques were compared side by side. These people were not just following tradition. They were actively seeking to improve their methods through systematic trial and error. The social implications of these innovations were profound. Successful new techniques created surplus food, allowing some members of the community to specialize in other tasks. This division of labor would lead to new forms of expertise and social organization. These agricultural innovations were more than just practical improvements. They were transformations in how humans understood and interacted with their environment. Each new technique, each adaptation, each experiment represented a deepening of human knowledge and capability. Travel with me across the ancient world, where one of humanity's most remarkable transformations is unfolding. Agriculture isn't emerging in just one place. It's developing independently in multiple regions, each with its own unique story of discovery and adaptation. In the valleys of China's Yellow River, watch as early farmers begin to work with rice. The archaeological record shows how they transformed marshy areas into productive paddies. These weren't simple fields but complex systems requiring precise water management. Layer by layer, we see evidence of minds mastering the delicate balance needed to nurture this demanding crop. Move westward to the Indus Valley, where different varieties of wheat and barley are being domesticated. The remains of their settlements show sophisticated irrigation systems, carefully planned to take advantage of seasonal floods. These people weren't just planting. They were redesigning their landscape to create optimal growing conditions. In the Americas, witness the remarkable transformation of teosinte into maize. This dramatic change didn't happen by accident. Generation after generation of farmers selected and cultivated plants with larger, more nutritious kernels. Though separated by oceans, their minds were solving similar problems in unique ways. The archaeological evidence tells us of other independent centers of agriculture. In New Guinea, we find some of the earliest evidence of banana cultivation. In Africa's Sahel region, native grains like sorghum were being domesticated. Each region developed its own agricultural toolkit, its own methods, its own solutions to local challenges. Study the timing of these developments. While some regions adopted agriculture earlier than others, the general pattern shows similar innovations emerging within a few thousand years of each other. This wasn't mere coincidence. It was evidence of human minds reaching similar conclusions when faced with similar opportunities and challenges. The spread of agricultural knowledge reveals fascinating patterns. We find evidence of farming techniques moving along trade routes, adapted and modified as they reach new regions. But we also see unique solutions emerging independently in isolated areas. These parallel developments tell us about the universal human capacity for innovation and problem-solving. Watch as different regions develop specialized tools for their particular crops. Stone hoes appear in areas growing root crops. Sickles emerge where grains dominate. Terracing techniques develop in mountainous regions. Each innovation reflects deep understanding of local conditions and specific crop requirements. The most remarkable aspect is how each region's agricultural development shaped its cultural evolution. Different crops required different social organizations. Different farming techniques led to different patterns of settlement. The agriculture of each region became intimately connected with its cultural identity. See how knowledge spreads between generations in these various regions. Some areas develop written records. Others preserve information through oral traditions. Still others create complex systems of symbols and calendars. Each society finds its own way to maintain and transmit crucial agricultural knowledge. The evidence shows us how different regions dealt with environmental challenges. Some developed sophisticated irrigation systems. Others mastered dry farming techniques. Still others created unique methods of soil conservation. Each solution represents a deep understanding of local environmental conditions. Most fascinating is how these regional developments began to connect. Trade routes carried not just goods but agricultural knowledge. Crops moved between regions, adapted to new conditions. Techniques were shared and modified. A global network of agricultural innovation was emerging. This period marks a crucial phase in human development, when multiple societies independently discovered and developed agriculture, each in their own unique way. These parallel innovations show us something profound about human cognitive capability and our species' relationship with the natural world. At sites like Catalhoyuk in Turkey and Mehrgarh in Pakistan, we see the full flowering of agricultural society. These weren't just farming villages anymore, but the first true cities, home to thousands of people living together in ways that would have been unimaginable to their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Watch as these settlements transform the landscape. Multi-story buildings rise from the plains. Streets and alleyways form complex patterns. Public spaces emerge where hundreds can gather. These weren't random developments but carefully planned communities, showing minds that could think on unprecedented scales. The archaeological record reveals how they organized their urban spaces. Specialized areas appear for craft production. Markets emerge where goods are exchanged. Religious buildings rise at central locations. Storage facilities grow larger and more sophisticated. Each element shows increasing social complexity and organization. Study their homes, and you'll find evidence of radical changes in how people lived. Private storage areas suggest new concepts of property. Decorative elements show growing artistic expression. Cooking areas become more elaborate. These changes reflect minds adapting to entirely new ways of living. The most profound transformations appear in their social organization. We find evidence of leadership roles, specialized crafts, and social hierarchies. Tools and ornaments show varying levels of wealth and status. These weren't just practical arrangements, but new ways of structuring human society. Watch as they develop new systems of record-keeping. Clay tokens appear, used to track exchanges and obligations. Symbols emerge that will eventually evolve into writing. These weren't just practical tools, but new ways of thinking about information and memory. Around their hearths, new forms of social interaction were developing. Community rituals become more elaborate. Festivals mark the agricultural calendar. Public ceremonies celebrate successful harvests. These weren't just celebrations, but ways of strengthening social bonds and community identity. The evidence shows us how they managed resources on an unprecedented scale. Granaries grow large enough to feed thousands. Distribution systems become more complex. Trade networks expand dramatically. These developments required new levels of social cooperation and organization. See how they dealt with new challenges of urban living. Drainage systems appear under streets. Waste disposal becomes more organized. Fire prevention measures emerge. Each solution represents minds grappling with the complexities of large-scale human settlement. The most remarkable changes appear in their craft specialization. We find workshops for pottery, metalworking, weaving, and stone cutting. Each craft represents accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. These weren't just practical skills, but the beginning of technological traditions. Watch children growing up in these new urban environments. Unlike their ancestors who learned primarily through observation of nature, these children had to master complex social rules and specialized skills. New forms of education and apprenticeship were emerging. These permanent settlements represent humanity's first great urban experiment. The cognitive capabilities that made farming possible were now being applied to the challenge of living together in unprecedented numbers. The seeds planted in fertile soil had grown into not just crops, but civilization itself. Stand here at the dawn of civilization and witness humanity's greatest transformation. What began with a simple realization that seeds could be planted and crops grown, led to a revolution that would reshape not just human society but the entire planet. Watch as the threads of our story come together. From the first hunter-gatherers who noticed how dropped seeds sprouted into new plants, to the sophisticated urban dwellers who created the first cities. Each step along this path required new ways of thinking, new forms of social organization, new understanding of humanity's relationship with the natural world. The archaeological record tells us this wasn't just a change in how humans got their food. It was a transformation in human consciousness itself. People began thinking differently about time, about property, about their place in the natural world. They developed new capabilities for planning, for cooperation, for abstract thought. Consider what this transition means. In just a few thousand years, a blink in evolutionary time, humans went from being participants in nature's cycles to being shapers of those cycles. From following the rhythms of the natural world to creating new rhythms of their own. This wasn't just adaptation, it was transformation. Most remarkably, this revolution happened independently in multiple places around the world. Different peoples, facing different challenges, came to similar solutions. This tells us something profound about human cognitive capability, about our species' unique ability to imagine different possibilities and reshape our world to match those visions. The legacy of this transformation surrounds us still. In our cities, our farms, our social organizations, our ways of thinking about time and planning for the future. The cognitive capabilities that made agriculture possible, abstract thinking, long-term planning, systematic observation, remain central to human achievement and innovation. But perhaps the most profound legacy is in how we think about possibility itself. Those first farmers looked at wild plants and saw potential. They looked at empty fields and imagined harvests. They looked at scattered bands of hunter-gatherers and imagined permanent communities. This capacity to see beyond what is to what could be, this is the true gift of the agricultural revolution. We are the inheritors of their vision. Every time we plant a seed, every time we plan for the future, every time we imagine how things could be different, we are using the cognitive capabilities that our farming ancestors developed. Their revolution continues through us. The seeds they planted grew into more than just crops. They grew into new ways of thinking, new forms of society, new understandings of human potential. This was more than a change in food production. It was the moment when humanity began its great project of reshaping the world according to our visions. That project continues today. The same capabilities that allowed our ancestors to transform wild grasses into wheat and scattered bands into cities now enable us to face the challenges of our own time. Their legacy lives on in our capacity to imagine, to plan, to shape our world and our future. This was the revolution that changed everything. Not just how we live, but how we think. Not just what we can do, but what we can imagine. It was the moment when human consciousness flowered into something new, when we became not just inhabitants of our world, but shapers of it. The greatest journey in human history had begun, and nothing would ever be the same.